Hey there, it's Pastor Rob here. Thanks for joining me. This is the video series that I'm doing on questions of human sexuality. Our denomination, the Christian Reformed Church in North America, is getting ready to consider a major report on human sexuality and what that means for our understanding of what is right and wrong and how we live that out and how we practice that in the life of the church. And so I've been doing this series of videos to kind of walk you through the recommendations that our denomination is making, some of the history behind this. And now what I'm going to start to do is transition into some study of the relevant Bible passages. We need to look at what does the Bible really say about these matters. Now, I will tell you that if you have access to it, the Human Sexuality Report, if you're interested in reading that, is very detailed, and it does great in-depth study on these questions. And so you could always look at that for real in-depth stuff. But in the next couple of videos, I'm going to take you through kind of a basic study of these relevant Bible passages. But I got to thinking a little bit about that, and I realized that it's really easy for us and for the church to simply explain or identify the problems in the world, right? Like I often say it myself, I'm real good at finding problems, but finding solutions is actually a lot harder. And I would maybe modify that a little bit and saying, finding problems is easy, but have we ever taken the time to really understand, before we understand what's wrong, do we really take the time to understand what's right? And what I mean by that is that I think before we can really understand why something is wrong or sinful, you have to understand what that thing was designed for. Because C.S. Lewis said in his writing somewhere, he said that that evil is a privation of good. And really all he means by that is that anything evil in this world doesn't just exist on its own as an evil entity all by itself. What sin does is it has this way of attaching itself to something that is good and then distorting it or twisting it around or misusing it, so that ultimately what sin is really all about is a twisting around or a distortion of something that is intended for good. And so before we even jump into the Bible passages that talk about the distortions of human sexuality, I wanted to spend a little bit of time on the creational purpose behind human sexuality. And I want to at least try to convince you or try to make the case that the vision for human sexuality that is laid out in the Bible is not something that we should be embarrassed about. It's not something that we should be ashamed about. It's not something that when we name something as sinful, we shouldn't do that in a sense of we're embarrassed about human sexuality or we're embarrassed about what God's designed for something. This is something that is worth not only embracing, but it's something to hold up as an ideal. I'm going to put something up on my screen here. I read this in Christianity Today. I think that's where it was, where it says, the Orthodox vision of human sexuality is abundantly good, true, and beautiful, and it points toward health and healing. And so I want to start by suggesting that what the Bible lays out when it comes to sex is something that we should be proud of. It's something that we as Christians should embrace and we should promote, because there's something really delightful and really important here. So what is it? And I think in that sense, there are three things. There's three components to this. And I want to just kind of walk through them one at a time and make a few comments on it. Maybe there's more, but I think there's at least three main pieces to why God created sexuality, what it is meant to communicate, what it's meant to do for us. The first is this: human sexuality is meant to be it's meant to be connection. Human sexuality is meant to bring two people together in a way that allows them to know one another more deeply and more personally than is otherwise possible. And so in Genesis chapter 2, where God creates Adam and Eve, we read that a man leaves his father and his mother and will hold fast to his wife, or will cleave to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and they were not ashamed. We typically interpret that to mean simply a comment or an observation about their physical state. In other words, we say, well, they were naked, they didn't have clothes on. That must be a sexual experience. And certainly, I think we can assume that it had that component, but what is really meant, I think, here is that the connection and the relationship and the vulnerability between man and woman was so complete and so total that that nakedness was a description of their whole being. In other words, they need to hold nothing back, and emotionally, mentally, physically, relationally, everything is shared with one another. And in that sense, then sex becomes a way of sort of completing this. Sex becomes a way for you to give yourself entirely over to another person. It's a way in which you experience vulnerability and intimacy and sharing in a way that that no other experience can deliver. So in marriage, sometimes marriages go wrong when couples misunderstand this, because if you're just focused on the actual physical act of sex, you're really missing the whole picture. And sometimes people assume that if you're having sex, you're being intimate, when really that's not necessarily the case. What God intends for your marriage is he intends for you to be actually relationally naked with one another, vulnerable, sharing fears, hopes, dreams, thoughts, feelings, ideas, just about everything. And then in that sense, when you become sexually intimate, you're simply completing the vulnerability. You're simply completing the act of connection and of intimacy. And there's no other experience like this. I mean, there's a lot of ways we share things with a lot of other people. You might exchange opinions with a friend. You might have discussions and disagreements with people. You might share you might share your emotions with another person. You might share, to a certain level, you share your fears, your concerns with a close group of friends. But as it's designed, you're meant to give yourself over to one person so totally and so completely. So when a couple, and in this way, you have to think of it in terms of and we'll get into this more in a minute, but it's a little bit like the act of sexual intercourse confirms the covenant that you've made. In other words, when you make a promise to one another, you stand at the altar, you're giving your life to that person, and then the act of sexual intercourse actually completes that. It confirms the covenant. And so every time a couple is intimate, they're reenacting their vows with one another. C.S. Lewis again, he says, the truth is that whenever a man lies with a woman, whether they like it or not, a transcendental relation is set up between them, which must be eternally enjoyed or eternally endured. And that's a very wise comment, is because this is not an optional aspect of human sexuality. You cannot not share yourself with another person when you are that personal and that intimate. My sense is that women are, I think, more attuned to this in men than men are. They're more aware of and tuned into the deep vulnerability and connection that happens with sex. Men are less so, though not that they aren't, but less so. So that's aspect one. God creates sex as a way for us to give ourselves over to another person completely and totally, as a part of being relationally intimate and vulnerable with one another. The second part is erotic enjoyment. And so this is one where, sometimes Christians have the reputation, and I think perhaps well-deserved, but it's the reputation for being very prudish or very restricted or limited when it comes to sexuality. Certainly a generation or two ago, this was common. And the fact of the matter is that Well, and let me just give you an illustration, especially if you look back through church history. When you look at how certain theologians and scholars have handled a book like the Song of Songs, it's striking. What you see is how frequently the book is completely allegorized, and commentators will make the case that it's simply a description of Christ in the church, and to read anything, any kind of love poetry in there, or any kind of sexual connotation in there, is to misuse the text. That's what some people have said over time. And I think that simply is indicative of the fact that we recoil at this idea that God intends sex for erotic enjoyment. But if you take that view, then I think you find that you will blush at some of the things that are written in the Song of Songs. The Song of Songs is it is love poetry, and it's written between a husband and a wife. And it's interestingly, it's written where the woman takes the lead in pursuing the husband, and they're simply enjoying not only intimacy but sexual intimacy. And what you're reading and what you're seeing is these descriptions of one another enjoying every aspect of their lovers' bodies, and it's actually incredibly graphic. It's stuff that you'd probably be inclined to keep your kids away from it, because it's so descriptive in ways that we don't often realize. And so I'll give you just an example. I'll pull it up on my screen again here. This is from Song of Songs, chapter 7, verses 1 through 5. And we read, give me one second. We read here this description. This is the husband describing his wife. And he starts off by saying, "How beautiful your sandaled feet, prince's daughter. Your graceful legs are like jewels, the work of an artist's hands. Your navel is a rounded goblet that never lacks blended wine. Your waist is a mound of wheat encircled by lilies. Your breasts are like two fawns, like twin fawns of a gazelle." What is easily missed here is just what it is that this man is describing. You'll notice, of course, that he starts off with feet, and then he moves up towards legs, and then he describes her navel, and then he describes her waist, and then he describes her breasts, and he goes on. Now, let me just be as direct as I can. When it talks about describing her navel, he is not, as we might be inclined to think, he's not describing her belly button. And the reason we know that is because, of course, he's describing her from the bottom of her feet up, and he's working his way up piece by piece. So starts feet, legs, and then there's navel, but then it wouldn't make sense for him to go navel and then back down to waist and then up to her breasts. It's that would be inconsistent. But what does make sense is that he's describing his lover's naked body. And importantly, there is another text later on in Song of Solomon that in which the woman does the same thing, and she uses poetic language to describe her lover's his naked anatomy. And my point in all of that is not simply to, it's not shock value. It's actually to point out how honest and how open the Bible actually is about sexual enjoyment. It really doesn't hold anything back. And so if you're a person that tends to be very conservative on in terms of sexual expression, the Bible will be very uncomfortable for you when it comes to seeing what it really says. And here again, this is something where in some people, their experience growing up in the church has been they hear a message that is very restrictive on sexuality, or it focuses only on the negatives, on the things that you're not supposed to do. And there's very little said about the positives, about what God actually intends and the beauty of eroticism. So the Bible gives us actually permission to enjoy that and to embrace that aspect of who we are. Now, in the Song of Songs, of course, it's clear that that relationship is between a married couple. They've been joined in wedlock, and that is described even in the Song of Songs. And so this is not just some passionate love affair. This is actually the intimacy and the joy of eroticism between a husband and wife, which is important, because for some of us, what we need is actually to live into this and to embrace this, and to recognize that God smiles upon and delights in the fact that he created us as creatures capable of incredible pleasure and enjoyment, and to deny ourselves of that within its proper context is actually to neglect a gift that God has given to us. Third, so that there's the first two. There's the purpose of sex is to bring two people together in a setting of incredible personal, vulnerable intimacy. It's to create the context for erotic enjoyment and delight in one another physically, sexual experiences. The third is a little harder to pin down, but I believe that what we see in sexuality, the third aspect, is that God intends to give us a sort of reflection of his own relationship with us, his people, and with and the relationship between Christ and the church. And so here's what that means. First of all, as I already kind of mentioned, sex is meant for the context of covenant. It's meant to be the giving over of oneself to another in a way that confirms the commitment that is made between two people. So when a couple stands at the altar and they say, "I do," they're actually pledging their lives to one another. And then they, in the act of sexual intercourse, they're actually doing that. They're actually giving themselves over to another person. Lauren Winner, I quoted from her earlier. I think I did, maybe I didn't. Anyways, Lauren Winner says, in a rich domestic context, sex is not about individual desires that happen to be neatly matched, but rather an embodied way of entering into a community with one spouse and of enacting God's love. So sex is a way of actually reflecting this covenant relationship, this covenant love that God has for us, and sex actually demonstrates that and allows us to experience a tangible way of God's love for his people. And I think you can even take that further. If you look at, since the 1960s, sex it's been much easier to separate sex from procreation. The advent of the pill, of course, had a lot to do with that. And I'm not saying, you should, birth control is wrong. I'm not even weighing in on that. I'm just simply making that observation. But when you realize that, of course, naturally, those two things they belong together, you actually see something really quite remarkable. You see, how is it that God creates the heavens and the earth? How is it that God creates the universe? And I think you can make the case that the triune God is a God, of course, who exists in relationship. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the three persons of the Trinity, exist in this relationship with, within the context of the Trinity. And it's a relationship, of course, characterized by love, sacrifice, service, self-giving over to one another. And out of that, in that context of that relationship, then what does God do? He creates. So you could argue, I think, that creation itself is an overflow of this relationship within the Trinity. It's an overflow of the love in which God creates in order to share that love with someone else, and to draw others into that communion of relationship between God and creature. And so the act of creation then becomes God's, this expression of, it becomes an overflow of God's love and the loving relationship within the context of the triune God. Well, I think you begin to see where I'm going with this, because ideally what you have in a marital relationship is two people, and out of this joyful union and this joyful oneness that they share, and this delightful experience of pleasure and closeness and intimacy, this two become one act of sexual intimacy has the potential actually to at least participate in the creation of new life. So ideally, the creation of life is meant to be the overflow of this incredibly enjoyable, vulnerable, personal relationship between husband and wife. And in that sense, it actually gives us a reflection of God. It actually points us to God himself. And furthermore, what you have in the act of sexual intimacy, of course, is two, male and female. When male and female come together, you actually get the most complete picture of the nature of God, because you have, when it talks about in Genesis chapter 1, it talks about God creating the male and female in the image of God. So it's the reading of the text is, so let us create man in our own image. And so God created man in his own image, male and female, he created them. The emphasis there is the fact that it takes both male and female to most fully reflect and capture the image of God. And so the act of sexual intimacy then does that. It brings together male and female together in a way that reflects the very nature and the character of God himself. And so, so sex is meant to point us to something about God. And of course, you can talk about the relationship between Christ and the church, the radical self-giving, sacrificial giving of Christ to the church. It's the love, it's the pouring out of Jesus for his bride, the church. All of this begins to illustrate what sexual intimacy is meant to be. Now, unfortunately, we have our culture has made a mess of human sexuality, and I think this is one of the reasons. Oops, I lost my screen here. Here we go. This is one of the reasons that as Christians we ought to lament what has happened to human sexuality. The last few years have seen the Me Too movement, which is a despicable, not the movement, but the actions described by this, people using power to manipulate and abuse and take advantage of women, is such a distortion. It's such an evil corruption of human sexuality, which is meant to be characterized by willing sacrifice and service, putting the needs of the other before you. And what happened, what Me Too, of course, captured was that it was just the opposite of that. It was using power to control and to coerce and to take advantage of women for personal gratification. It's the exact antithesis of what the gospel is all about. The gospel says, I will lay down my life for you. And the many widespread claims and stories of sexual abuse say, you will surrender yourself for me. And so it's this massive distortion. Or the picture on the right is not it's more of a stock photo, but it captures the hookup culture. Lisa Wade is a sociologist at, I forget the college that she's at, but it's down in California. And she wrote a book that captures what she calls hookup culture, which is this prevalence of sexual encounters on college campuses. And it's just assumed that people are having these very casual sexual encounters, and it's meant to be, she puts it, a drunken sexual encounter with ambiguous content that is supposed to mean nothing and happen just once. It's a scrappy little sex act, a wayward Cupid, armed with a dark night and blur of intoxication. Its aim is a fun, harmless romp, a supposedly free expression of one's sexuality, but within oddly strict parameters. It's a fascinating book, and in there she describes the rituals. She describes all these unwritten rules that go into what the hookup culture, the parties, the sexual experiences on campus. And part of what she describes is this desire to have these sexual encounters without any relational baggage, with no commitment whatsoever. And again, guys tend to think that this is more possible. But what they all end up finding out, guys and girls alike, is that actually it doesn't work. You have these sexual experiences with a person, and as much as you think it means nothing, in the end, there's a connection that's made. And that leaves people pain, disappointment, frustration, and so on. So, so Lisa Wade's point, and my point here, is that the distortion, all of this is a distortion of what God intended to be good, and I think this maybe illustrates why the biblical vision for sexuality is something that is really worth contending for, really worth seeking after. So, okay, this is just a summary, of course. There's more we could say, but we're going to leave it at this. Thanks for watching. We'll the next couple of videos we're going to dig into now. So what does the Bible say about homosexuality? Why is this a concern? Why is this something that Christians should care about? Thanks for watching. There's more videos. You can subscribe. You can like the videos. And don't forget to check out the other videos in the series. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next time.